Is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? Will it be beneficial to all concerned?
This is a really intimidating experience because usually I have my back to the audience. I just came from doing children's concerts today for 2,500 children. And what was so important to me, one of the works was by Russell Peck, who devoted his life to Save Our Children Foundation, and he actually helped to build it. My wife has said, KISS, keep it short. And this is not about music. This is not about my road as a conductor. I'm talking to people that I consider part of the most wonderful fraternity in Lancaster that have embraced me and have allowed me to feel comfortable enough to talk about this. My mother and her parents were born in Gleiwitz, Germany. And at the time, in 1933, Jews were no longer allowed, and my mother and her family were Jewish, they were no longer allowed to attend concerts. So as a result, in 1933, there were two orchestras formed, one in Berlin and one in Frankfurt. They were called the Kulturbund. They were exclusively made up of Jewish musicians, and they performed exclusively for Jewish audiences. My grandparents and my mother and her sister wanted to help in this effort, and so they housed a couple of the musicians when they happened to come to this little town of Gleiwitz. One of the musicians was named Horst Salomon. The other was named Kurt Blank. And they were first and second French horn in the Kulturbund that came from Berlin. Well, my mother and Horst fell deeply in love, and they swore eternal fidelity. But then, as a musician, Horst had to continue with the orchestra, and my mother said to him, "Look, I want to make it very clear, if you don't write to me every day, I will be convinced that you took advantage of me." He swore eternal fidelity, and he swore that he would write to her every day. In the meantime, there was this horrible situation in Germany, which kept progressing and getting much worse. Her parents, my grandparents, started one of the first dry cleaners in Europe called the Zorski Reinigung. My mother was a nurse, and she would travel from Breslau to Gleiwitz to be home. A Nazi officer didn't know that she was the daughter of my grandparents, and he said to her, "You know, you better get the hell out of town because it ain't going to be good for those older people you're taking care of." My mother passed this along, and then they decided to get exit visas. They could not get exit visas to the United States, but they got exit visas to Bolivia. And in Bolivia, they set up the first dry cleaning in all of South America. It's still in Bolivia, in La Paz, and it's called Zorski Tinteria. So here you have my mother waiting to hear from Horst. No letters, nothing. She feels discouraged and absolutely distraught. She proceeds to find the first man she can on the street and marries him, and then writes a letter to Horst. "I don't know where you are, but," and I don't want to use horrible language, but really go to hell. "And I have gotten married." And then she left Gleiwitz with her parents and her sister and immigrated to La Paz, Bolivia. Horst, in the meantime, gets to Palestine, and Toscanini hires him as the principal horn of the Palestine Philharmonic, which became the Israel Philharmonic. So he wrote to my mother, "We can now get married. I have a great position." My mother got to La Paz when she saw this letter from Horst. she immediately divorced her husband. This had to be in 1938. Hust, in the meantime, is now in Palestine, and he gets a letter from my mother that she got married. So he immediately marries a soprano. These musicians, what can I tell you? So let me interrupt the story briefly to talk about my father's side of the family. They were amongst the leading social family in Frankfurt. My grandfather, Karl Gunzenhauser, who was born with a kind of strange religion, it's called nothing, but his family officially were Jewish. Now, that comes right down to the present day, because for those of you that heard Gregory Scott, there is a Gunzenhauser mansion in Lancaster. That Gunzenhauser mansion was built under the auspices of Johann Christian Gunzenhauser, so he obviously was not Jewish. So the Gunzenhauser family goes both ways. But it's interesting because Johann Christian Gunzenhauser was the son of Heinrich Kaufmann Gunzenhauser. Kaufmann means salesman, and most frequently it is used to describe a Jewish person in German. It didn't necessarily work out that way because his wife was obviously not Jewish, because they named their child Johann Christian Gunzenhauser. It was the largest bakery in Pennsylvania in 1950. He came here in 1863, 1864, so he was here before the Gunzenhauser mansion. As a matter of fact, Gregory Scott and I have had some discussion, and I asked him what would be the price of the mansion today if I were to buy it so that Shelly and I could move back. He said $750,000 on Orange Street. I think it now is a salon called Posh, but it's on Orange Street, close to downtown. So at any rate, my father grew up in a very wealthy family. He hardly knew his mother and father because he was raised essentially by governess. And as things started to get a little dicey, he moved to the United States with the expectation that his mother's brother, Franz Grödel, would help him, because Franz Grödel, his uncle, was the founder of the EKG machine and was also the founder of the American College of Cardiology. When he arrived at Franz Grödel's house, Franz Grödel told him, "You have to learn to make it on your own, go wash dishes." So with a degree in metallurgy, he wound up washing dishes in New York for about 3 weeks. Then he was able to obtain a job in Bolivia from a man named Hochschild. Hochschild was the head of the tin industry, but was German. He was happy to have my father as his assistant, who was also German. My father got to Bolivia and he decided, it's time for me to rent a place. I don't know if this is going to be a job for me. And he found a room in the home of my mother's family and rented there. He was a big deal at the time, and so he anticipated having a date for New Year's Eve with the daughter of the president. It didn't work out because he went before New Year's Eve to have a drink with my mother. And my mother gave him some kind of sleeping tablet, so he never made it to New Year's Eve. Then my mother, who is now divorced in the 1930s, which was not the same as being divorced today, he decided to take my mother to the best restaurant in La Paz, Bolivia. And my mother goes with him to this restaurant. And he says to my mother, "What would you like?" And she looks for the most expensive steak on the menu, which is filet mignon, which she had never heard of. She ordered the filet mignon. When my father saw the look on her face, she was very unhappy because it was so small. So my father, trying to be nice, said, "Would you like another filet mignon?" And she said yes. So my father was immediately attracted to this woman. My father worked for Hochschild, who was the head of the tin industry, and in doing so, Hochschild had to work relating to the president of the country. The president of the country was there because the Bolivian army had one tank. Whoever controlled the tank was president of the country. So, Hochschild told my father, I want you to control the tank, and I want you to be president so you can initiate some laws that are more comfortable to our business. My father, unfortunately, one of the people he told was a friend of the sitting president. So my parents came to the United States in the late 30s, early 40s, as escaped refugees from a failed coup d'etat. My mother, unfortunately, was very young when she passed away. She passed away at 59. But my mother and Horst, the French hornist, who was also married with 2 children, never gave up their connection. And my mother died of ovarian cancer at age 59, and Horst took leave of absence from the orchestra in order to spend time with my mother. And I think the person who deserves the Medal of Honor would be my dad for understanding and being compassionate in understanding my mother's connection to Horst. It's also interesting that Horst's firstborn son also is a conductor, and he is the associate conductor of the Israel Philharmonic. And there's a very interesting story associated with that, which I can share with you. Horst, when he retired, I went to visit him, and he said, I want to give you a gift for your wife, Shelly. And he was a clockmaker. So he built a clock that has everything in reverse, just like when you read Hebrew, it's in reverse. This was the ugliest thing you have ever seen. But I said, thank you very much. When I got to the airport, it was ticking, and the customs guards said, you can't take that with you. I said, oh, good. And they held up the plane for 15 minutes while they disassembled it and then put it back together again. And I had to take it home to Shelly, and Shelly said to me, who are we going to give this to? So it went to Goodwill, and I'm sure that there is a family somewhere in Wilmington, Delaware, that is trying to figure out why the clock goes in reverse, not clockwise. So that basically tells you about my family, and I didn't want to make this a long, drawn-out speech. Like my wife has always said, kiss, keep it short. There's another S there, but I didn't want to get into that. My wife and I are going to celebrate our 48th anniversary next month. We live, according to literature, Leo Tolstoy, War and Peace. Only with us it's every day. We hope you've enjoyed this. Thank you all very much.
Questions?